Okay, so let me introduce the researchers very quickly. We have an esteemed panel, including Julia Kopich, who's the president of Kopich and Associates, and she and Dan Humphrey, who's an education policy consultant with SRI International, both did some research around LCFF, some of the different multifaceted elements of the reform. Julia Marsh, who's joining us, is from the University of Southern California, and she really dug into that component around stakeholder engagement, which we know is a core piece of LCFF. And finally, Rucker Johnson, who's joining us from UC Berkeley, did some analysis to try and look at, well, what has been the impact of LCFF, and what are we seeing in terms of outcomes for kids, which is obviously the primary goal of the work in this area. So with that, I will turn it over to Julia and Dan.
Thanks, Samantha. I'm going to start, and I'm going to stand right here and pretend I'm tall. If I stand behind there, it never quite works. So, as Samantha said, Dan and I and Julie Marsh are part of a group that is called the Local Control Funding Formula Research Collaborative, quite a mouthful. We're a group of 7 senior researchers, so in addition to Dan and Julie and myself, Jennifer O'Day, David Plank, and Laura Stokes have been working for 4 years and counting now, examining implementation of LCFF. And my AV aide. And as a result of that work, we have done 30 case studies in districts and county offices of education. We've interviewed more than 500 individuals of all kinds of stripes in districts, county offices of education, also parents and others. And we've conducted random sample statewide surveys of both principals and superintendents. So those are our data sources. What did we find? I'm going to start a little bit, and then Dan, and then Julie will give another take on it. We found that there is widespread support for LCFF. That's the good news. For LCFF principles, including equity, if there ever was a question about it, there should be none. Great support. You can see from these numbers, 94% of superintendents, 97% of principals agree that students with greater needs should receive additional resources. Large percentages of superintendents and principals agree that stakeholder engagement, that requirement does give families new opportunities to influence district decisions. And 82% of superintendents, 85% of principals say that LCFF is actually leading to greater alignment among goals, strategies, and resource allocation in their district. And they agree by large percentages that the fiscal flexibility brought about by LCFF enables them to spend in ways that match local needs. Now, one caution is that small and rural districts are different. It's not that they don't support LCFF, it is that they are less enthusiastic, driven largely by very different needs in small districts and rural districts. We can get into that more in Q&A if we're interested. There's one anomaly, one of 2 anomalies I'm going to mention. About a third each of superintendents and principals believe that LCFF removes protections for high-needs students that were there under categorical funding. We're not sure how to interpret that, but it's there. I'm not going to talk about stakeholder engagement, an enormously important part of the law, but Julie will talk about stakeholder engagement. I'm going to talk about the ever-popular LCAPs. We interviewed a lot of people on LCAPs. I don't know that a single interviewee said, oh goody, LCAPs. And so our findings are not all that complicated. That LCAPs try to serve too many purposes simultaneously. They are both meant to communicate to communities, they're meant for planning and budgeting, and they're meant for accountability, at least accountability to their community. Can't do all with the same document. There still remains confusion, both about how supplemental and concentration funds can be used. What do we say about about them in the LCAPs, about how we're using them, what's legitimate, what's not. And additionally, there remains confusion about what funds generally should be in an LCAP. Do I put in all the base funds? Do I put in federal funds? We don't know. And if you asked 4 county offices of education, you'd be likely to get 5 different answers. We examined a set of LCAPs, and we found that we could discover little differentiation about strategies or dollar investments that specifically would serve the needs of English learners and foster youth in order to help them meet the Common Core state standards. So we generally found in our research, our case study research, that people in districts and in county offices, but primarily districts, found LCAPs burdensome and cumbersome. There's a little trepidation because now the ESSA LCAP addendum is being additionally added to the LCAP document. It remains to be seen how that will play out. But one of, I think, our most concerning finding is that in many places the LCAP is viewed as a compliance activity. It's another document to complete for the state. And people in districts don't even know the state doesn't really ever see the LCAPs. Still, it is viewed as a state compliance activity. Having said that, here's my second anomaly. Second anomaly is that when we on the surveys asked superintendents and principals, what do you think of the LCAP? Well, they basically said, it's a good tool for communicating with parents and the community. Something else we're not quite sure how to explain. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan now to talk about other pieces of our paper.
Okay. So I guess my first question is, how much of my time is Julie Kopic used up?
Oh.
Just kidding. So let me just start by saying 2 things about LCFF, 2 things that it is not. First of all, it's not a weighted student funding formula. That is, money is not tied to individual students, it's tied to groups of students. And if you're a district with target group students, you get a little bit more money. If you've got a high concentration of target group students, you get a significant amount more. The second thing is that LCFF does not increase the amount of money that the state spends on education. That is really what it does instead is simply redistribute the money that Prop 98 designates for school spending. So typically, the first thing we heard from superintendents was that they really liked it, as Julie pointed out, and in the same sentence they said, and we don't have enough resources. And as one superintendent told us, I don't think you can provide targeted supports on top of a foundation that is deficient and expect to get great results. The other thing that we heard from superintendents and chief financial officers as well is real concerns about the adequacy of funding on top of the fact that they are really worried about their financial future. So they often point to increases in pension costs. A lot of the districts that we visited were experiencing declining enrollments, which meant less revenue, and but it was the stirs and purs changes that really concern people. One chief financial officer told us the killer is stirs and purs. The increasing rates are ridiculous. We're going to be at 20%, and we were at 8.25. I should mention that 20% is where they are now, and it's going up. So in the early years of LCFF, the debate was largely around districts' transparency and whether or not the supplemental and concentration dollars were actually getting spent on target group students. And these 2 quotes, and I'm not going to read them, but these 2 quotes sort of summarize both the promise and sort of the disappointment of the LCFF. The first one was, quite laudatory, and the second one was very concerned about the continuing disparities. And the thing about it is that they're both true. That didn't turn out very well. So anyway, I guess the thing that we asked superintendents how they spent their money, and this was their response. This was the distribution. And generally speaking, from our case studies and from the survey work, we found that in general, districts were actually spending the money on programs, on supports for the target student groups. There was not widespread misappropriation of funds that we could find. Having said that, we did find some examples where districts were spending supplemental and concentration funds on things like school security or remodeling bathrooms. And neither of those things really meet the sniff test for appropriate spending. So there are some examples of that. We also found that, and Julie pointed this out, but I just want to highlight in the professional development. Although we saw and we heard about professional development being used to help teachers meet the needs of these target students, we did not find very much differentiation in the strategies, in the professional development strategies, to meet the needs of English language learners or foster youth. It was somewhat generic in terms of professional development. So this slide basically raises highlights a few issues regarding resource allocation. And Julie mentioned the different interpretations. We certainly found different interpretations of the appropriate uses of supplemental and concentration funds. And in some cases, we actually found districts that were busily recategorizing their base funds and putting them in the supplemental and concentration fund category in order to sort of balance their budgets in ways that they wanted to. This kind of creative accounting is highly questionable, but we did see that. And in a few cases, we actually found districts that we were using supplemental and concentration funds to equalize funding across all schools rather than distributing it to achieve equity. Having said that, we also found that districts were doing budget decision-making processes differently than they did before LCFF, that they were moving towards a much more collaborative, much more needs-based budgeting development system. As one district official told us, this year we began the budget development process with what do we need rather than from what can we afford. Even with that, we found that most resource allocation decisions were still being made by the central office, although we did see some trend towards school-based decision-making. And finally, Julie mentioned small districts and the special concerns they have about this. We found that small districts have at least three challenges. First of all, their own leadership capacity really limited their ability to implement the LCFF and do the kind of community engagement that is expected and that would work. Secondly, the small enrollments made it really difficult for small districts to account for all of their supplemental and concentration funds in strictly proportional ways as the law requires and as county offices require them to do. And third, small districts' limited capacity meant that they really had to rely heavily on their county offices, and that the degree to which they got helped or hindered by that relationship really was dependent on the capacity of the county office and the county office's various interpretations of the law. So we are just embarking, in fact we had our first interviews this morning, we're just embarking on a new study of the very, very early implementation of the new system of support. So it's important to realize that even though we've been at this for 4 years, the LCFF is still a work in progress, and we're still implementing components of it. And the system of support is going to be absolutely crucial to its success. So we are going to take a look at the system of support. A lot of it relies on the county offices, but there's also expected to be collaboration between the CCEE and the CDE and the state board. And so we're going to take a look at those relationships, but primarily we're going to focus on the what districts are actually getting from their county offices. A year ago, we surveyed county office superintendents, and we asked them, are you ready for the new system of support? And 7% said they were. So a lot's happened in a year, so this is old data, but it does indicate sort of the challenges that are associated with the new system of support, and there's lots of them. So we'll share this later. This is just the research questions that we have for the new study, and I look forward to conversations about all this. And I'll let Julie Marsh take it from here.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to go deep into one area. This is a work that I've done with a group of graduate students and also with the LCFF RC. So one component of the policy that I'm sure everyone's aware of has to do with the fact that there's a mandate within there that there's engagement of parents, students, educators, community in developing the LCAP. And the state has in there an expectation in the template. It says that there should be meaningful engagement, but there's not a lot of specificity around what that is. And in theory, the idea of this, if you go back to the policy and talk to the folks who created it, was that engagement would be both an opportunity for accountability, that it would hold district leaders accountable when it's made public and the community's involved or stakeholders are involved, but also might be a way to improve efficiency of decision making because it's now letting local needs drive our resource decisions. So we had done some early work on this. We're looking in the first year and in our studies, and what I wanted to do in this work is look across time and also look at a couple areas that we hadn't really focused on, and so we have 3 research questions for this report. It's 80 pages long. I know it's real. I'm going to try and sum up the main points, but I encourage you to look more. So we wanted to look at over time how districts interpreted and implemented the engagement component of LCFF. We wanted to look at the role that school board members are playing, because in theory, the school board members would have greater authority in some sense. If you think back to why this came to be, in the last Getting Down to Facts, there was a lot of concern that people didn't have the authority to make these decisions. So we wanted to understand more deeply really what was the role that board members are playing in allocating resources. And then also we wanted to ask the question of so what? Like, how does this relate to how resources are being allocated in terms of the nature of engagement? How did that relate to questions around equity and resource allocation? So I won't go into the methods. We drew on the same case studies that Julie and Dan mentioned, just to say that we transcribed all these interviews and reanalyzed them for the 3 years. We drew on the survey of superintendents that Dan and Julie mentioned, and then we also drew on a poll that we do every year through PACE USC Rossier that had a bit of evidence around registered voters and their views on LCFF. So my first question in this report drew on the 3 years of data to really understand who was involved, what were they doing in forms, and for what purpose, what shifts have we seen over time, and what explains some of the patterns. So in terms of who, overwhelmingly in our cases and in our surveys, we found that districts have really struggled with participation. In the survey, more than half of superintendents statewide, when we asked them to describe the nature of the level of engagement, more than half said it was either average or poor. And I don't have it up here, but in our poll, we asked if only 5% of registered voters had attended some sort of LCFF-related activity. And in particular, superintendents on our survey said that it was difficult to engage parents and guardians of the target groups. So more than 53% said it was difficult to obtain input from parents and guardians of English learners, 65% low income, and 72% foster youth. So big challenges around engagement. There has been some learning over time, and so, for example, leaders had been telling us in our case studies in the later years that they were learning more effective strategies, doing social media, networks, going on Spanish radio. We also saw over time greater involvement or efforts to involve students in the middle and high school. So in the first years, they couldn't get it together in time, but over the next couple of years, they've really learned to involve them in advisory groups or representing students in different ways or focus groups. Overall, in terms of who was involved, we also see over time fewer cases of what I would call narrow, and again, the paper goes into my framework, but the narrowness, meaning in the first year, we saw some districts just appointing a group of people or using a pre-existing group that really wasn't representative. So we see fewer cases of the truly narrow and much more representative. And then a minority of districts that we're calling outliers are actually really engaged in broader forms, where they're actually going out and trying to get traditionally underserved individuals involved, and doing a much better job of getting attendance at meetings and response rates of surveys and things like that. In terms of how they're being involved and for what purpose, so we see that districts are trying a number of different strategies, and we have survey data on it. They're doing meetings, they're doing surveys, they're doing advisory groups. Over time, what we saw, though, is that there were a lot of issues in the first year or so where these big district meetings were reported to be not very effective, and in particular, that the loudest voices were being heard. And so what we were seeing over time in our work is that actually districts are shifting a bit. One, they're shifting to do more of these individual stakeholder group meetings. So they're meeting with the PTA, they're meeting with principals, they're meeting with different groups separately. So in that sense, it enables people to sort of say they're have more of a voice. They're also doing more at the school level. So there's a feeling in a lot of the districts that we've gone to that people might be more comfortable coming to their school to do this kind of engagement. And finally, informal meetings. So we have cases of people going out, district administrators going out into the community, to churches, to Kiwanis Club, to try and get input that way. I mentioned the trade-offs here because in some sense, while it's allowing people to be more comfortable in giving their views, it's not allowing different stakeholders to hear one another's view and come together collectively to negotiate a vision for the district. And I would argue that's potentially problematic as well and worth thinking about. And then aside from these few outliers that did go into this sort of a deeper form of engagement, the majority of districts are what we would call more shallow in their forms of engagement, meaning that it's a one-way kind of giving information or getting input, but there's not this sort of reciprocal two-way conversation going on. So why is it? Why are we seeing the difficulty and the low levels of participation, and in some sense, this more shallow form? What's interesting is when we asked superintendents on the survey, the ones that had categorized their level of participation as poor or average, 91% said, well, the stakeholders aren't interested. But if you go to our survey, our poll data, more than 60% of voters, and even more of the voters who had kids in school, wanted to be. They say on the poll that they want to be involved in making decisions around goals and resources. So in that sense, I don't think interest is the issue here that's explaining some of the challenges. And so we go into a lot of depth in this paper, but essentially there are lots of other things that are going on. One is a limited awareness. In the poll, only 17% of registered voters had heard or read a good deal about LCFF. And we ask about it not using the term LCFF, and that's not that much more than what we had heard the year before. So there's a lack of awareness. There's also fatigue. By the third year of this, people were saying they're meetinged out, they've done this a lot. Capacity issues, individual level in terms of understanding the budgets and all of this, and also at an organizational level that not a lot of districts have the capacity to do this. There are issues around trust. I don't have time to go into all these. Appropriate roles. Lots of administrators saying that they just didn't think it was appropriate for the community to be engaged in these kinds of decisions. And then I end with these sort of outliers, the ones that are going deeper and broader, and what we find in those cases is they often have a partner that they've been working with, like some sort of intermediary organization that's been helping them get out into the community and build the capacity. And they've also had a history of former or prior strategic planning that might have brought together some of these people before LCFF. Okay, takeaways. So overall, I would say that we're finding that there's alignment with the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law in terms of meaningful democratic engagement. There's support for this. There's good faith efforts to go to comply. But given the low levels of participation and the limited opportunities for cross-stakeholder engagement, I would argue that the spirit is not quite there. But there is some hope in some of these outlier districts that really show what is possible, and that these conditions that we see associated with deeper and broader forms actually might give us some ideas of where we might bring about some improvements. Really quickly, my second question was around the role of the school board. We draw on 3 years of data here, mainly case data and a bit about the survey data from the superintendent's perspective. And we've basically find, so this is from the superintendents, we asked them how their board members were involved. And while the majority of them are saying that their board members have approved the LCAP and have participated in the public meeting to a moderate or great extent, only a minority of district superintendents are saying that their school board members had attended other kinds of meetings, served on committees, initiated or led meetings, and helped write the LCAP. And our case studies show that too, that there were very few cases where we saw board members going beyond just the formal approval or that one board meeting where the LCAP gets brought up into the public meeting. And so what do we say, what explains this? So partly it's around this, we heard over and over again in a lot of places that this wasn't the proper role, that this wasn't within the purview of the board to be doing this, that in some ways it was a conflict of interest for the board to be more engaged. The second thing was that there was a perception that board members don't often have the knowledge and expertise to be engaged in questions around budget and resources. And then the final one is that if you go to the cases where we did see greater engagement of the board, there was actually a school board member who was leading the charge, or a superintendent who believed very strongly that this was the role to be playing. So our takeaways from this are that board members are fulfilling the required duties, right? In the law, they have to sign it and they have to hold a public meeting. But there are some questions here about more, is there more that could be done? Particularly if you go back to my answer to my first research question, which is really, if we aren't seeing a lot of engagement, particularly from traditionally underrepresented groups, then is there more that the board could do as representatives elected by the community to engage those voices? My final question is sort of exploratory analysis where we look in just the third year of our data and we try to understand how district actors are thinking about equity, district leaders primarily, how they're engaging the community and allocating resources, and how these things relate. So when we asked them, Dan got into this a little bit, we asked them in this third year what do they, sort of how they think about equity, and we saw a lot of variation, that there were some people who actually think about equity as equality, that it's giving equal to all. And that might be quite different from what the intent of LCFF, if we go back to Governor Brown and his thinking about this, right, and the whole notion of giving more money to high needs kids. And those conceptions relate to how resources were allocated. So in these districts where leaders told us that they think equity means equality, we were seeing that spreading of resources evenly across districts regardless of student population. And that also seems to be related to the engagement process. So in a place that actually had a very strong understanding of equity as giving more to those who are higher need, we saw much more targeted engagement of underrepresented populations and stakeholders, and a deeper kind of form of engagement, and also resource allocation that sort of fit more of this targeted giving more to these schools that had higher needs kids in it. So there seems to be some relationship. I can't obviously talk about causality, but there's something about the way we think about equity, the way they're engaging the community. So my final takeaways are just that I think this work points to some needs. I think that we have a lack of public awareness about LCFF, and also some confusion perhaps around what we mean by equity, as that last example showed us. I think that there's some confusion around the purpose of engagement, and some questions going on now about what's the value of doing this year after year. There's some concerns around district capacity to actually do this work well, but also how are we building the capacity in the community? The idea was bringing the politics down from the state to the local level, and it's not clear that the local level has the capacity and understanding of how to engage. And if you're a community that doesn't have community-based organizations, there's not a lot of resources out there to help you do that. I think that there's some confusion around the role of the board and the board members, and that could be looked at, and also some deeper thinking about how equity, resource allocation, and engagement are all related. So those are my takeaways.
Okay, great. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Rucker Johnson. I'm just going to try to summarize. I'm honored to be a part of this panel and part of the Getting Down to Facts group. I'm just going to try to summarize our work. This is joint with one of my PhD students, former PhD students, Sean Tanner. And just to kind of make sure we're appreciating the importance of understanding our system, just take a step back. 1 in 8 students in the U.S. are educated in our California public school system. It's the largest in the country. And what you want to kind of remind yourself is before LCFF, right, until recently, California had this outmoded school funding formula that had grown cumbersome, that had a whole litany of kind of categorical programs that had become highly inequitable and was not having the kind of transparency. And so it's in part on the wings of a Great Recession that had a huge foreclosure crisis that disproportionately affected lower income communities in a way that had not yet been fully recovered in 2012. That meant that in many districts there was a shortfall of about a 20% decline in funding for those 2 years following the Great Recession. That it was on that the urgency of a funding overhaul fueled the kind of what has become, I believe, the flagship legislative achievement of Governor Brown with the local control funding formula, the first major school finance reform, since really Serrano in many ways. So the key thing about when there are a great deal of uncertainty around school funding from year to year is that school districts tend to not engage in bold curricular reforms that can span a decade. And in many ways, LCFF was the counter to that, committing $18 billion over 8 years. And what that did is it allowed a kind of consistent form of what the commitment would be, and that the funding would not be tied inversely to property tax wealth, but rather specifically to student need as represented by the proportion of kids that would be high need, as we've defined in the prior discussions. And so what we did as proportion disadvantaged, meaning English proficient, eligible for free or reduced price lunch or foster care. And what you can see in this first figure is certainly that the LCFF funding per student, going from the kind of most affluent districts to the most disadvantaged, is that there was a kink in the formula at which there was a greater increase in funding, increasing at beyond the 55% concentration level. And what we're going to do, this study is among the first to provide causal evidence of the impacts of the LCFF's impacts on student outcomes. And there's really 2 dimensions upon which I want you to kind of consider what this increase in funding represented. It wasn't just that we went from kind of a middle-of-the-road progressivity of our funding formula, but we went from kind of middle-of-the-road to becoming one of the most progressive funding formulas in the country, and it gave significantly more discretion and autonomy for districts to use the money in the way that would be tailored to maybe their local needs. So what we try to do, this is just showing you the funding sources just so that you can see this significant increase, because it was rolled out incrementally, meaning the first 2 years after LCFF passed, there was still not any way close to fully funded. So we're really in the infancy of this actual evaluation of the program efficacy, because it was only fully funded toward the end of year 3, and now we're in year 4. So that's just important to keep in mind. And what we're going to do is we compiled data for all public schools in California from 1995, annual data using the very detailed district finance data from 1995 through 2016. And then we matched that with the student outcomes, where we were conceiving of their access to what the funding of schools were in the schools that they attended, where we're looking for impacts of the LCFF reform-induced increases in spending on high school graduation rates as well as high school achievement in both math and reading. And what we try to do is recognize that the funding formula creates differences that are pretty vast, where a affluent district like Marin receives relatively little LCFF relative to a place like Oakland Unified, or at the extreme, Compton is receiving roughly $3,000 per pupil spending after it was fully rolled out. But in addition to that, there was a significant change in the proportion of the state revenue that would have categorical restrictions, or a reduction in those that would, have more discretion. And so there's two kind of dimensions upon which LCFF is having a change, not just in the amount of money, but in the discretion. And so those are the two components that we're trying to decompose so that we can isolate what the impact of the funding increases were, independent of any ways in which the increased discretion had impact on the composition of spending. So we're basically going to isolate the causal effects of the spending by comparing children from the same district, from the same actual schools, across cohorts before and after the LCFF-induced increases in spending. And this is going to be over and above like statewide trends and over and above cohort-specific time trends. And so what we find is that, in other words, we're trying to look at these student outcomes, and we recognize there's two components, the revenue piece and the discretion, but we have to have a way to kind of be sure that these attributes of revenue and discretion are also related to the composition of students in those schools. And so we're using the policy changes in the formula and the reduction in restrictions to get and isolate the independent effects of the funding, okay? And what we first show is that really, I guess in the interest of time, I'm gonna not say this. Okay, so let's just keep going. Okay, so in the interest of time, I just want you to see that leading up to the change, this is the change in revenue that a district got on average if they were a low poverty district in blue, and this is one for the high poverty district. Now what I want you to think about is this is like a dose response. In other words, that the amount of impact on student outcomes we believe should be increasing in the number of years a student was exposed to the increase in spending and increasing in the dosage. That is, how much did LCFF increase the dosage? So I'm looking at, this is the district per pupil revenue that I just showed. If the spending has a causal impact, I'm expecting to see student outcomes exhibit a similar pattern, that this is reflecting the increases in the spending. And in fact, when we look at high school graduation rates, again, we're going to use the 2013-14, 2014-15, 2015-16, 16-17 school years, where it was 90% funded by year 3, 100% funded by year 4, and we're going to use the NAEP scale adjusted test score data subject for the 11th grade, okay? And we're not going to be including charter schools, but what you can see is leading up to the LCFF is a flat trajectory, meaning these impacts are not likely to be driven by pre-reform factors like the Great Recession and other changes, but rather what we see is a roughly 5.9 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school for students that were exposed to a $1,000 increase in per pupil spending in their 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade years consecutively. And in fact, we see very little change in student high school graduation rates for those students that did not receive a significant increase in spending due to the LCFF changes. And these outcomes that I'm showing right now are for poor kids, but we actually find for the high school graduation results similar results for low-income students as well as Hispanics, similar by poverty and race. On the other hand, so this is the summary of those in terms of the figures that kind of demonstrate that increase, where that then led to a narrowing of the high school graduation rate gaps. So when you look at the top, this is the district revenue from the state that I was saying how LCFF increased spending. Notice the parallel pattern with that on outcomes. This is the spending, this is the results we see on outcomes. And similarly, we see the same thing when we look at high school math achievement. Now remember, California has the largest socioeconomic achievement gaps of any state in the country. And math is one of the key biggest gaps. What we're seeing is actually that a $1,000 increase in experience in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, in 4 consecutive years, that $1,000 increase in spending led to a 0.19 standard deviation increase in math achievement. And again, as I said before, if you look at, this is the spending part, and then this is the results we see for math achievement. Yes? Okay, so in the interest of time, let me just summarize by saying we think that we have found, these are the results for a $1,000 increase, as I was saying. experienced throughout the high school years, meaning these are not the effects that come from a single year investment. These are multiple year investments that are sustained. But because we're now in year 4, they suggest that if we continue these efforts, that they would continue to have significant impacts in closing academic achievement gaps. Now, the one thing about replicating success, even when it's early, is that you have to know the mechanism, like how is the money being used? So we try to explore the mechanisms, like how much of that money is going toward reductions in class sizes, how much of it is going toward instructional expenditures, buildings, employee benefits, things that might not make it to the classroom if they're in the form of significant pension deficits that many districts are experiencing. We found that a significant amount of this particular iteration of LCFF was getting to the classroom in the form of increased instructional expenditures and reductions in class sizes, and that we believe that that's a big reason why we found that these changes in per pupil spending caused by LCFF led to these increases in high school graduation rates. Let me just reiterate, we find the effects are increasing in spending increases, we find the effects are increases in the number of school age years of exposure, and we find no evidence of pre-reform differential trending that would suggest it's really due to other factors like changes in economic conditions. And we find these results across a whole host of different kind of methodological strategies. And again, to put their perspective, the kind of magnitudes in perspective, this 0.19 standard deviation increase in high school math test scores associated with a $1,000 increase in spending throughout the high school years is akin to basically 7 months of learning. For math, for the reading, it's not unusual for school reforms to have smaller impacts on reading. And we find their results are akin to about 3 months of learning. More of our reading achievement is centered around what happens in the home. We understand that, so that's less surprising that. But the point I guess I would say is we're finding money matters, and we find sticking to the course, and our future work is going to be looking earlier in the school career to look at the pre-K investments and the interactive effects of the pre-K investments and the K-12 spending. I should stop. Thank you for your time.
No, that's great. Can we give our... Great. Well, why don't we open it up to questions from, please.
So my question is going to relate to budgetary change. For 20 years prior to LCFF, the argument of schools was the state you're micromanaging with 80 different categoricals. You can't treat all 1,000 school districts with the same kind of a fit. You need to give us the opportunity for prioritizing for us to be able to make change and to be able to respond to our local needs rather than you establishing those needs from the state level. So my question is, to what extent have you seen specific budgetary changes? If you took a base year, pre-LCFF, and compared it to today, would you see more counselors, psychologists, librarians, resource teachers, K-3 reading programs, Saturday school, after-school reading programs, summer school programs? Would you see significant change in budgetary priorities as a consequence of LCFF?
Okay. Do you want me to take that, or you?
Go ahead.
I'm going to just speak on the quantitative side, though I think there's important qualitative components that others on the panel could speak more directly to. But on the quantitative side, we actually look directly at the composition of spending to not just know the aggregate amount of spending, but how has the composition of spending, where we try to disaggregate by instructional expenditures, those that might include support staff like counselors and guidance counselors, et cetera. And we do see more adults per student in the school that we believe is leading to these positive effects. But I cannot tell you exactly which investments, like whether class size reductions are more effective than increases in teacher salary. I can only say that the increases in buildings, like expenditures toward buildings, we see not associated with the student achievement gains. If I found that, I actually would say sniff test. I believe my results myself, right? Because if I'm kind of building new buildings, I'm not necessarily thinking of those as all of a sudden causing math test scores to get a significant boost. So I think we are finding some of those things, but it's still a little early. So like health services, like whether we have nurses in schools, those are investments also that we see some uptick in after the LCFF. Does that?
And Dan, did you want to?
No, I think Rucker pretty much nailed it. The only thing that I would want to caution us about is about the variation from one district to another. So that we do see, in our case study work, we've definitely seen what Rucker's describing in some districts, but not all. So it's a good news story, but it's not a completely, we haven't crossed the finish line.
Other questions?
I guess I would just supplement to say that that data is available. The state database, the J90 report, could give you a pre-measurement and now a post-measurement of district distribution of expenditures. You could also see it maybe in some of the ed data reports.
Yeah, I should have said.
That are available on an annual basis.
I agree, and I should have said that's what we use. I was only trying to suggest that there is some school resource intra-district, like in other words, I can say something at the district level. What I'd like to be able to say is how the district is spending the resources within the district, like the intra-district resource allocation. That's what you don't hear me saying a lot about, because that actual information is much more like proprietary. It's much more of like a black box that I can't get my, yeah.
Please.
For Dr. Johnson, I was curious, based on your analysis, I know it's very complicated to tease out some of these factors, but I was wondering, is there a way to estimate, if you take the average student, and let's say we want to close the achievement gap, how much does that sustained funding look like and over what time period?
Can that question be answered right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main important thing is sometimes when there is a change in political leadership, people want to just jump to something new. And I sometimes think we need to make sure we emphasize, while improvements need to be made, we should try to highlight what things that are being done seem to be beneficial. But they cannot be beneficial unless they're sustained. So I'm gonna leave it at that for now, but I'll let other people comment.
Other questions, please?
Yes, in regard to the district's thoughts about community engagement and somewhat of the frustration in terms of, I guess, the depth and authenticity of engagement, I was wondering if your study pointed to ideas that they felt they needed to go in terms of increasing the effectiveness and capacity. You mentioned that purpose was not always clear. It was hard to engage stakeholders in meaningful ways. And then understanding the roles of the board in this, potential roles of the board in this. And I just wondered if the work had put out some signs in terms of direction.
Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about the outliers in particular?
Yeah, so I would argue that if we go to the outlier districts that we identified to say, what was it that they did, or what were the conditions in those places that led to deeper, broader engagement, that's where we could see some clues of what is the potential. And again, as I said, most of those had a partner that they'd been working with that helped them do the outreach, right? So that when you have limited district staff, right, so these folks could go and actually do grassroots organizing and mobilizing, and they facilitated those meetings. So part of what happens in those meetings often with the loudest voices, and right, so that you have a professional facilitator. And then again, I think there's a history here that a lot of these places were places that did strategic planning. And this understanding that LCAP was going to be a strategic plan, I think in all of our work we have found it is not a strategic plan. As Julie was saying, they think of it as a compliance document. But the places that are engaging community in meaningful ways have prior plans that they've developed that are using a very different process and a different set of tools than what we have with LCAP. And so again, that would be another sort of factor, but you all might. And there's a trust level that is established in these places through that effort, through the engagement in a strategic planning process that was, again, facilitated by some other outside organization.
And given the, oh, did you want to? Oh, no.
I was just going to add one thing, because Julie mentioned the strategic plan, and it's something that has gnawed on me a bit from our research results. I know researchers are supposed to be entirely neutral and not want particular outcomes. I wanted the LCAP to be a strategic planning tool, and it definitely is not. In fact, in the districts in which we did case studies, and some of them had dynamite strategic plans. They were comprehensive, they were understandable. Everyone in the district, from the elementary school janitor through the classroom teacher, the assistant principal, and the superintendent, knew what it was and could talk about it, and in none of those places did the plan, in all of those places, the plan preceded LCFF. So it's a puzzlement. We're not sure that that's what the state policy intended, but if it did, we're not there yet.
Oh, there's a couple more questions. Go ahead.
Well, my question's related to that. Like, how in depth was there feedback on how it could be improved, like specifics in terms of the LCAP itself, about what specific changes would be made or how to streamline that process so that it doesn't become like the accountability dumping ground? I'm editorializing now, but.
And I'm only smiling because it was in either year 2 or 3, we said to interviewees who complained bitterly about the LCAP for all the reasons we've detailed and others, and then we said, so what would you like? We hate it, but don't change it. Literally, that was the response. We kind of thought they maybe were getting used to it, but it's changed now 3 times in 4 years. We're not sure what they're used to. So it's a really good question, and we don't have an answer.
Yeah, I kind of wish Jennifer O'Day was here because she could talk to you about some work that she's leading with a set of districts that are trying to rethink and reinvent the LCAP. And so there is some effort out there to make it better. And we've been calling for the entire time we've been studying this to try some experimentation and try new models, allow a better way.
So I'm going to ask a moderator question on this. We can continue to have this larger group discussion, or and I think this has been framed up nicely, some of the key issues here. One is the LCAP and the use of it as a tool. Does it make sense as a standalone? Are there things that should be changed? Or to some of the schizophrenia in the field, just don't touch it and leave it as it is because we're just getting used to it. And so sitting down with Julie and Dan to have that conversation. Another piece of the conversation is around the stakeholder engagement piece, and Julia did a really beautiful job laying out a stakeholder engagement framework, as well as digging a little deeper in what are the contributing factors that allow for these outliers to be successful, as well as what doesn't matter, right? Because we have assumptions about what matters, and many of them may be off. And then the third piece is LCFF, as Rucker talked about, is an allocation tool, and we have a method in place. We've seen the distributional impact of that. Do we need to have a conversation as a state about reopening the formula or not, right? The advantages and disadvantages of moving in that direction. So those were the 3 kind of deeper table talks where the researchers would also come and help have the conversation. Do you want to have that as a discussion, or would you like to keep it together? So for those who would like to just keep talking as a group, raise your hand. Okay, those who would like the deeper discussion? Okay, I think that because I did it that way, next time I'll flip it. All right, let's keep talking as a group. And then also, for those of you that are interested in any of those topic areas, let me know because you can grab some of those materials. I do think the researchers did a really nice job on this front, laying out some of these pieces.
Could I ask a question for our fellow panelists? Okay, so
Take liberties.
My question is, as a person who's really invested in evaluating what works, I'm frustrated by why we don't require some standardizing of how the LCAPs are reported, digitized, in some kind of electronic form so that one could actually be able to know and analyze whatever they're doing to be able to replicate success if there is some. And I guess I just don't understand, like, and you would know, and I know you've been a great advocate of whatever, but I just want to maybe voice your thoughts on what should be happening and why isn't it happening. It seems like we're California. We're Silicon Valley. We have technological innovation everywhere. We're IT everything. And it just seems like we're dinosaur in this.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Go ahead.
I get to take the first shot at that? Great. So first of all, I'm not an advocate of the LCAP. I am an advocate of doing something that we can see what people, not necessarily the LCAP. I think, I'm going to say something that's very impolitic, and my colleagues or any of you can jump all over me. I think that the state, so the governor's office, CDE, the state board, have been too reticent to provide some kind of, I hate to say standardization or rules, but some sort of way of casting what work is being done in a way you could look across districts for what works or what I might try. And I think the state's concern is any sort of assistance is too much guidance. It takes away from local control. So I think that pendulum has swung way too far to every district doing its own thing, and every district doesn't know how to do it. How would they? How could they possibly? I don't know that the LCAP is a solution to anything particularly. So I go back to, wouldn't it be nice if districts had something that was called a strategic plan with broad outlines that you could look at and say what's working and how do we change what's not? But I think it is, I honestly think it's well-intentioned state policy thinking that has swung too far to, we can't offer suggestions because if we do, it takes away from the localness of local control.
And what I'd say, kind of building on that, is that there is this tension about what the LCAP is meant to accomplish,
Yes.
right? And I'm looking around the room, right? There are many of us who have very strong focus on the fiscal transparency piece, the use of it as a tool for engagement, ideally as a strategic planning tool that helps you think about budget and outcomes and what you're trying to accomplish. And it does make me wonder, per the research that you guys put out there, are we trying to accomplish too much in this one space? And are there ways to think about other mechanisms? I mean, we didn't have the dashboard when we first started the LCAP, right? And we have a finance system that, SACS account codes, which, for better or worse, that's what we have in place. Is there a way to do a crosswalk between these things so that they're more effective, or does that not make sense? Do we really need to hold it within the LCAP to be that central tool? And I would be curious of your reactions to the ability to toggle between those things effectively.
So knowing our own limitations, we, in the very early years, we asked economists to come and help us figure out what was in the LCAPs and to try and do a crosswalk just on the finance side, right? Between that and the state reporting, the state reporting system. And she threw up her arms in the air and said, "This is impossible. It's not going to work. We can't do it." There are we had the misfortune of looking at probably 100 of these things, and there are examples where a district's been pretty transparent about some aspect of their budgeting. And typically, in the good cases, you'd see, here's how we spent supplemental and concentration dollars, and it was just easy to follow. But that was a rare case. And it didn't include all of the dollars. So, I think there's a structural problem with the LCAP, and I don't think that digitizing it or trying to use technology from that source is going to get us anywhere. I think we really need to reinvent it.
I'd add just one other quick thing. As of, I think it's next July of 2019, the state board is supposed to design, I hate to say these words, a new template that is supposed to increase transparency and is supposed to be set up in such a way that you can crosswalk between the district budget and the LCAP and is meant to be more transparent. What that will look like, I don't know, but I mean, at least there is a recognition that we're not there yet. We haven't done a good enough job.
And John, I know you're waiting patiently.
Julia, when you first started talking, you mentioned that superintendents noticed that they lost control over categorical spending for low-income kids, and when we did LCFF, and I wonder if it's too much to infer from that, that's their request, or even perhaps a plea for more clarity or even tighter rules so that supplemental concentration dollars are committed.
I don't think so, actually. Not that I ever want to counter a journalist, but I don't think so. Our survey finding was that about a third of superintendents and principals each thought that they were better able to serve high-needs kids. In all of our interviews, we didn't have a single person who said go back to categoricals, not one. They did say, and this has been taken care of, that they'd like more flexibility with supplemental and concentration funds. In other words, they wanted to be able to spend for other high-needs kids who are not part of those target groups. And that is supposedly going to happen this year, and we'll see to what extent. So it's not that people want to return to categoricals. I really think that even though it's been 4 years, districts are still finding their way. And part of finding their way is this is just hard, and part of it is there is little, I don't want to use the word direction, but little showing the way, or even offering, here's a district that did this and it worked statewide or even regionally. I think that's been a huge issue.
And on your point, Julie, that $300 million for the lowest performing subgroups that went out in this year's budget, it was a one-time thing. So I do think that that's likely to come back and be a part of the discourse. Did you? Yeah, please.
Parker, and this might be just when I grab the cup of coffee, I missed this part, or I just need to dig in a little bit more. So the comparison, obviously, and I like your analogy about the dosage, almost if you're giving somebody medicine, if you didn't get it as compared to those that got a huge infusion, what that caused. Can you reiterate, or if this was part of the study? So when you're comparing two patients that are both getting the high dosage, and this kind of gets to the funding distribution piece, what are we finding there? Because not all reform was created equal, and then the spirit of local control is that people are trying very different things. So what are we finding as you compare two districts, two schools that are both getting, are you saying that we're seeing those gains regardless of what they tried, or was there some disparity amongst those?
I see. So I think going forward, as I hear your question, it is, imagine you have two students that are both exposed to the same amount of change in funding, but one, the district did not have a change in the amount of discretion, and another, there was a significant change in discretion. And what would the outcome of what would the students' outcomes be, similar or different? I think what I'm saying, my results are summarizing is holding constant the discretion part. What's the independent effect of the spending, holding that constant? The question you're asking is what I think I need a little bit more years of data to have better precision to kind of say, does the spending interact in a specific way with the discretion?
And in particular, different strategies.
I'm not yet comfortable going that far.
Or
how the money was spent.
Right.
Like when I say, what's the mechanism, what's the pathway?
Someone had coaches
Right,
and
is it not just the money
Is it-
itself,
gave
but
it
what
to
they're doing?
salaries or
Yeah,
something.
like how much of it is how they're spending it, that's the big difference.
Yeah.
I don't have enough years of data to kind of get better at that, but we're pursuing that.
And that's a good follow-up question. So you're planning on re-upping this
Oh,
study?
we're already, we're just as soon as more data come, because this is, it's something that we're constantly trying to learn from. And the mechanism is not, we don't have enough information yet to do that. And then we want to go earlier in the career, the school career, like elementary school, preschool, we want to get the full.
And Mary, I know you were waiting patiently too.
I'm looking at the question up on the screen and wondering, when we talk about the fact that the ambiguity in the LCAP instruction around financial reporting is something that we've seen, districts interpreted differently, so on and so forth. Is that a place for legislation, or is that a place for regulation?
And I'll just note, and I know you know this, Mary, last year through the budget, there was a deal passed in the budget and then subsequent legislation that did call for this change that has to be in place by 2020. But I think the question still stands because it's probably beyond just the LCAP. You're also maybe talking about other fiscal transparency.
Right, and what you count as your LCAP budget, and whether it is enough to have it just be those LCAP dollars per se.
Legislation scares me. You know, you open things up, you never know what's going to happen. We've been calling since the beginning of our work for somebody, the state or somebody, to just start putting out examples of, if you want to think differently about your budget, or if you want to think about how to help English learners reach Common Core standards, or if you want to talk, what would I look at? Who would I look to? Who would I talk to? That would be a first step. I don't know that legislation or regulation are necessarily the way to go.
And along those lines of what you're lifting up, I think the hesitancy has been, because I know advocate groups have been asked to do this too, can you point us to an LCAP or a strategic plan that seems really effective?
Right.
And it's like, I can tell you something that looks good on paper, but without the data to know, what is the impact, I'm hesitant to say, look here. And so I think that coupling that you're doing to try and look at, okay, well, what's the actual impact, is critical for us to be able to make that next step. Dan, you have the last word.
Yeah, oh, good. I think that we're actually betting on the system of support to provide those examples. I think that the various efforts that are underway between the various agencies, with the counties at the center, is in a lot of ways an attempt to try and identify the exemplars and share them widely across the state. Whether or not we have the capacity in those various groups to pull that off is a big question for us.
Well, thank you all. We really appreciate it. And they're reconvening back downstairs. Thank you.